1812 was a transformative year in the Napoleonic Wars. For whilst Napoleon launched his disastrous invasion of Russia, ultimately squandering the lives of 500,000 men, at the other end of the European landmass, his Spanish Ulcer, which was the Peninsular War, began to bleed. As the Allies won key victories at Ciudad Rodrigo in January, Badajoz in April, and Salamanca in July, they opened up an opportunity that had not even been a dream for 3 years: the liberation of Madrid. Maintaining that liberation would turn out to be more challenging than it appeared, as the Allies wrestled with the unsolvable Rubik's Cube that was the strategic situation of the Peninsular War in 1812. But as Allied troops marched into Madrid, stayed in autumn, and then left, how were they treated by the locals? Tonight, Gavin Daly returns to the Napoleonic Wars pod for a deep dive into British troops' experiences in Madrid in 1812. We talk euphoria, dalliances, revulsion, and disdain, all of which were on display sometimes at the same time and sometimes at different times. This is Redcoats in Madrid, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your quartermaster Liam Telfer, the Redcoat in residence. That's very much a new self-title that I've given myself, but you know, seeing as though the Bow and Share Emperor, Dr. Zach White, seem to be able to get away with that, I'm jumping on that. And speaking of him, he is by my side as usual. Zach, how are you, my friend?
I am good, bud. I'm loving Redcoat in residence. There isn't even going to be a Saki comment or anything. I just don't know how we didn't get to that earlier.
Well, I thought, as I am the one with the red coat, why not? And like I say, you guys seem to throw your own nicknames around, so I'm gonna pin it down. Listen, we've got a very, very special guest with us today, coming live with us in the recording from a very long way away. Gavin Daly, all the way from Hobart in Tasmania, is a senior lecturer in modern European history at the University of Tasmania. He has published widely on Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars, with his research focusing on the cultural history of war, British soldiers' writings and violence and the laws of war. His most recent book, Storm and Sack, British Sieges, Violence and the Laws of War in the Napoleonic Era, 1799 to 1815. That's published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And you'll be pleased to know that Storm and Sack is now available in paperback. Thanks for joining us, Gavin. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, Liam.
It's a real pleasure. And like I say, joining us with, I can't even work out what the time difference is. It is huge.
Hours.
11 hours. I think that might be one of the biggest time difference recordings we've had, Zach.
Yes. I'm sure Bob Burnham from Hawaii will be sort of saying, well, hang on, what about my time difference? But I keep forgetting what Bob's time difference is. Sorry, Bob. He will be listening to this and he will be offended. I mean, hell of a way to start an episode to offend one of your patrons. Yeah, it's you can't get much further away from us, which is just not good enough, Gavin. You know, you need to just kind of set up a second home on the South Coast so that Liam and I can bombard you with questions whenever we want to.
Yep. Or perhaps next time if I end up somewhere in Antarctica.
That's a plan. Do you know, we've actually had listeners from the Antarctic continent. It's one of the bizarre things. I'm convinced somebody went on a boat, listened to sort of 5 seconds of the show by mistake, and therefore it counts, but I'm going to cling to it because it means that we've been heard on every single continent. So why wouldn't you make that claim?
Was it you, Zach?
No, of course it wasn't me. It was one of the penguins. Like,
okay.
The little understood, like emperor penguin, like there's a very obvious connection. I reckon the emperor penguins are trying to better research the heritage behind the term emperor. It sounds as though I'm tripping at this point, doesn't it? We should probably move on. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. I shouldn't be this kind of wired as I clearly am. Quickly, Liam, ask a question.
Indeed, I'm going to wrestle. I'm going to wrestle the mic back before we go too crazy. Gavin, starting from a British viewpoint,
Mm,
um, what were the soldiers of the period's sort of preconceived ideas of Madrid, and I suppose, in fact, Spain in general, prior to their arrival in the country, and where did these ideas come from? And I'd love to link in with that, if that differed between the rank and file who were perhaps less well travelled, less educated, in comparison to the officer class.
sure. So there's a number of important issues there. I guess the first is that Madrid doesn't feature largely in British soldiers' imaginings of Spain before they go to Spain. Madrid had never been on the Grand Tour. Spain, for that matter, hadn't really been on the Grand Tour. And then you've got people like Byron popping up and posturing and putting it more firmly on an unorthodox Grand Tour of Europe. But certainly British soldiers, if we start with British officers, their imaginings of Spain before the Peninsular War are complex. They're often ingrained in deep traditions within British society, and they're also framed by some ideas of Spain that really enter their consciousness during the war itself and the outbreak of the war on the British home front. So many of those stereotypes of Spain are quite hostile and negative, particularly the idea of the Black Legend, the Protestant legend from the 16th century onwards, of a superstitious, tyrannical, despotic Spain that's anchored in the Inquisition, cruelty, atrocities in the New World, etc., etc. So that's very much part and parcel of an inherited Protestant tradition in Britain that, in some senses, transcends class. So that's also part of how some soldiers from common backgrounds also imagine Spain as a Catholic, superstitious other, and one that's a traditional enemy of Britain. That's there in most of the times. Britain's at war with France in the 18th century. Who's there as well? Spain. And they're there all the way through until just the outbreak of the Peninsular War itself. So there's that very negative connotation of Spain in terms of the black legend. But you've also got and you've got officers reading some of the travel accounts of Spain that are appearing in Britain in the 18th century, novels like Robinson Crusoe. That's also the most popular English novel, most popular novel in Britain in the 18th century. That also has elements of the Spanish Black Legend in it. But then you've also got a romanticization of Spain prevailing alongside that, with the Romantic movement appearing in the late 18th, early 19th century, Gothic stories by Anne Radcliffe, Romantic Mediterraneanism, the climate, the landscape. So that's figuring as well. And you've also got Don Quixote, the traditionally seen as a buffoon, but in the context of the 18th century, there's a growing appreciation of Don Quixote in England amongst educated readers, and a kind of revisionist critique of chivalry. So that's part of a growing movement in favor of chivalric traditions. And so Spain is the heart of, together with medieval France, the heart of many of those chivalric traditions, like the Cid, and Don Quixote feeds into that. So all that's bubbling away. And then you've got the outbreak of the war itself and patriotic Spain. So this idea in the British press, through cartoons, through pamphlets, through stories circulating about extraordinary Spanish resistance and Spanish patriotism and the fight for Spanish liberty. So all that is framing how British officers, and to some extent common soldiers, are perceiving Spain. You've also, interestingly too, just prior to the outbreak of the Peninsular War, you've got a number of British regiments that will travel with Wellesley to the Peninsula to Lisbon in 1808, but they're coming indirectly from South America, where they'd been fighting the Spanish in the ill-fated River Plate campaign, and they're not coming away with particularly fond memories of the campaign, nor of the Spanish. So already those soldiers are carrying notions of Spanish treachery, Catholic superstition. Um, so that's bubbling away with those soldiers. In terms of common soldiers, there's some degree of overlap, and I think we can create too big a gulf between the officers and common soldiers in terms of how they're imagining Spain. About 40% perhaps of common soldiers are signature literate, certainly in some regiments. And certainly from the memoirs that we have, some of the rare edited collections of letters that we still have, like Private Wheeler, we find readers amongst those common soldiers. What are they reading? Some of them are reading Robinson Crusoe. They're engaging in print culture, John Fox's Book of Martyrs on Bloody Mary. That's ingrained in British society and culture in the 18th century. It's bubbling away within certainly parts of popular culture. So that's there. Some of those soldiers are reading travellers' accounts. They're there on the home front during the outbreak of the war. They know Spain's the traditional enemy. And there are those oral traditions. So it seems extremely unlikely that soldiers who had some sense of Spain or who had been in South America weren't conversing with fellow common soldiers and having conversations even before they arrived about what they might expect. So it's a complex and shifting picture about imaginings of Spain, I think, in terms of both officers and common British soldiers before they arrive.
So cue myself and Liam scrambling to dive in first to ask the next follow-up question. Look, folks, we listened patiently to the first question and we waited until our guest finished the first question before we started our rabbit holey follow-ups. But this is the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and in the reviews, what I'm noticing, P.S. Yes, you should go and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you to those of you who have done. Apologies to my guest who is baffled at how we've kind of gone off on an advertising spree at this point, but you're partway in the episode. Please make sure you leave a review because it helps. But sorry, to get back, apologies, Gavin. Podcasting admin aside, I instantly want an episode on literacy in the British Army now. As Liam nods enthusiastically. So watch this space, listeners. I guess I want to kind of continue to delve into one of the things you picked up there, which was the recent history. You've had boots on the ground in South America. You've quite obviously had boots on the deck or feet on the deck at Trafalgar. There is this sort of very, very recent memory of Spain is the enemy. Spain is the nation that we go and fight. They're tied up with the French, almost sort of cheek by jowl. How effective do you feel that sense of separation that needs to be achieved is facilitated with this kind of push from the British press to emphasize, Spanish patriots, this idea that actually the Spanish are fighting for liberty and that's a cause that the British can sort of side with. How effectively do you think that manages to trickle down? Because we talk a lot about sort of this sense of astonishment and widespread acclaim, this belief that the entire Spanish nation is sort of up in arms. But getting that message out there is one thing. Projecting that to the public, to the soldiers, to the officers is one thing. Actually having that resonate and take root is a different thing entirely. Do you think that kind of 180 that is attempted ever actually works?
I think it's a really good question. I think it has, relative to what sources we've got available, it varies. It has a mixed and limited impact. So the most important thing I think to recognize there is that this is coming on top of deeply entrenched xenophobic and anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish prejudices within British society that have been there for several century, certainly since the 16th century in the age of Philip II, the Spanish Armada, and they're not easily dissipated. They never go away. And so they're easily reactivated and come very much to the surface as British soldiers in Spain seek to understand and find meaning in a lot of their disappointment. There are certainly idealists. We see that with some of the correspondence amongst some of the officers about going off and fighting for liberty and hoping that they will find this chivalric, liberty-loving, patriotic Spain, despite how that fundamentally contradicts traditional conceptions. And you see some of the great cartoonists, like Cruikshank and Gilray, already in their cartoons hinting at the odd nature of this juxtaposition of going off to fight on the one hand for liberty, yet only a year ago we were still locked in conceptions of Spain as this tyrannical despotism. So yes, it has a limited impact, but there's nevertheless a hope and an idealism. And we certainly see that in a lot of both contemporary writing by soldiers and then memoirs, certainly afterwards, but also in contemporary writings where there is a sense of disappointment that those hopes from their perspective have largely been dashed, at least in the early years, because those notions of patriotic Spain and the idea that the Spanish are willing to fight for their own independence and we're going to be welcomed as heroes and liberators, that does change to a degree over the course of the war. And certainly Madrid is the central part of that romantic patriotic Spain for how British soldiers experience that. But early on in the war, no, there's just one disappointment after another. And that's compounded by the nature of those campaign experiences. Coruña is a horrendous retreat, humiliation. Talavera, they don't get the support that they thought they would. And so the rationalization there is partly about ungrateful Spain betraying us. So they easily fall back into those entrenched British stereotypes of Spain.
Yeah, I think it's interesting trying to change that. Like you say, the really deep-rooted suspicion of Spain, and I kind of want to look at it from the other side of the coin if we can. And I don't know if there's if that's something that you've ever come across, but are there any preconceptions of the British from the Spanish perspective? Are we a sort of Protestant, warmongering? I don't know. I'm sort of throwing words out there, but is there anything that we've got on what the Spanish think about the British before their arrival in the peninsula?
Are you basically asking our guest whether the Spanish think the Brits are a bunch of heathens?
Well, I mean, yes, of course, but just in the interest of balance, I think you kind of we're sort of heavily Anglo-centric, and I just wonder how much how our stereotypes are presented to Spain.
Certainly so in terms of how the British are writing about how they themselves feel they're being perceived by the Spanish. And Madrid's a separate case because we can clearly see that there's this extraordinary sense of relief that the British have come, and this genuine euphoria and jubilation at the British arrival, and a genuine, sincere celebration of them as liberators. Certainly, many British Protestant soldiers believe that they're perceived as heretics. Irish Catholic soldiers don't. And we need to bear this in mind when we're talking about the British Army. Yes, it's overwhelmingly a Protestant institution, but we've got a very large contingent of Irish Catholic soldiers and some non-Irish Catholic soldiers within the British Army. And certainly their experience is not that. but nevertheless, those Irish Catholic soldiers still share many of the same prejudices that their Protestant redcoats have about Spain. So that's a challenging question. I'm not that familiar with a lot of the Spanish material on that, but from the British perspective, they did see themselves as being um, treated poorly by the Spanish in terms of hospitality, but there can be a whole series of factors for that. They're ungracious hosts. There could be reasons for that. That they're wary of any army coming in, and certainly later in the war, certainly at high levels of politics in Spain, there's growing concern about Wellington, of course, being given command of the Spanish armies. So at the high political level, and it's playing out after the siege of and sack of San Sebastian. You see all this playing out about a growing anxiety about British power in Spain, British military power in Spain. But certainly, yes, the term heretic comes up quite often in British writings on how they feel they're being perceived by the Spanish. But one would imagine that many of those stereotypes, the negative stereotypes of the British harboring about the Spanish, likewise, there's a corollary there with how the Spanish people are perceiving the British, although they are coming in as inverted commas liberators to help in a patronizing way.
I just want to go back and look at perhaps the sort of Irish perceptions of Spain. You know, you talked about the Irish making up such a huge contingent within the British Army at the time, many of whom would have been Catholic. And are their perceptions of Spain, do we think, different? And are they then perhaps treated differently by the Spanish in turn?
So we don't have a lot of Irish Catholic accounts of the Peninsular War. We have Charles O'Neill, for example, the Irish Catholic rankers account, and some others but generally speaking, Protestant redcoats thought Irish Catholic redcoats were better treated than they were, and they tended to encourage Irish Catholic redcoats to act as sort of cultural intermediaries, as if an Irish Catholic redcoat would be more welcomed in Spanish circles, particularly when they were dealing with priests and when they were dealing with the Catholic Church. But if you look at O'Neill and some of those other Irish Catholic accounts, many of their perceptions of Spain outside of the religious context, although it's difficult to separate the religious from the political and socioeconomic and the cultural more broadly, but those Irish Catholic soldiers still share many of the same views about Spain that you find with Protestant redcoats, but they're certainly much more favourably disposed towards Spanish Catholicism. And in fact, sometimes they meet Irish priests. They meet Irish priests in Spain who will act as cultural intermediaries. I mean, there were many Irish priests that had studied at Salamanca, for example. But when they do meet Irish priests, they sometimes act as intermediaries between those British soldiers and the local community.
Obviously, we unashamedly rabbit hole, but we should probably bring it back to Madrid in the context of the episode. And it would probably be quite helpful to just kind of dig into where Madrid is at this point in the Peninsular War. You've had fundamentally 4 years of French occupation by 1812. The Dos de Mayo is a distant memory at this point in time, albeit a highly emotive memory and a very sore one. You've had a francesado, that's a French sympathizer. Excuse me. How can I say the Spanish word and not the word sympathizing? That's a French sympathizing population that has, I'm not sure if it
Mm.
was always there or whether it's built out, but it's become the one of the mainstays of French um, control, I guess, over the Spanish capital. So when news comes in of Salamanca, firstly, how how openly can people celebrate if they're inclined to celebrate? And also, how how has Madrid fared over the course of those 4 years of French occupation?
So a number of things there. So when news reaches Madrid of Salamanca, we're still talking about Josephine control and rule, and there's my sense is there's no celebrate there are no celebrations until Joseph leaves Valencia the day before the arrival of Wellington. So Joseph leaves for Valencia on the 11th of August. And what's interesting about that is he just doesn't depart with his troops and so many carriages of personal belongings, but there are thousands of civilians that also travel with Joseph to Valencia, the so-called French sympathizers who'd been, some of them had been there in Madrid, others had gravitated to Madrid since 1808. So they know what fate may await them if they stayed in Madrid. Um, so they exit to Valencia with Joseph. So it's the seat of the Josephine states from 1808. It's the center of Josephine power. You've got the rallying of Spanish sympathizers. You've got the Joseph's decrees being emanated from there that have a limited impact the further they extend beyond Madrid, which highlights the urban-rural problem that the French faced in their rule in Spain. And Joseph, it's not a, he despite reintroducing bullfighting, he struggles to win over the hearts and minds of most of the Spanish. On top of this, with Madrid, is that from 1811 onwards, and it goes well into 1812 until the summer harvest of 1812, is that Madrid is afflicted by terrible famine in 1811 and 1812, that Goya, for example, captures in the disasters of war. And that's a catastrophe. And some of the estimates of the death toll is in the thousands in Madrid. And the British, that situation's slightly alleviated with the new crops coming um, in the summer of 1812. But it's still a pretty dire situation. And the British, we can talk about that. The British, it's one of the darker sides of Madrid that very few of the British soldiers write about. But that's there. It's still there, the legacy of that. And it highlights that in the Peninsular War, so many of the deaths, like most wars in early modern Europe, are not through fighting, but they're through death and disease. And that's even true of the Siege of Saragossa. So that's an important point to bear in mind, that the regime, without question, under Joseph is being partly blamed for that situation. Um, and so that's another reason why there's a sense of jubilation when the British arrive in early August. Yes, that's the situation and it's the largest Spanish city, around 170, an estimated 175,000 at the start of the war. That's diminished some because of the famine, dislocation during the war, and you've now got an exodus of those who were sympathising with Joseph's state.
I think that links really nicely to what to moving on to how the British and Allied Army was received on its arrival in Madrid. I know you said this jubilation, but actually, what you said about the famine there, I think, is really interesting because I can only imagine. But I'm certain that there must have been some wariness from locals, once again being occupied by thousands of soldiers with limited resources, to go around, especially having only being rid of the French, for a very, very short period of time.
Mm, mm. There are one or two British sources that talk about the two-faced nature of the fickleness, and this feeds into sort of traditional British tropes of Spanish treachery, that they're being two-faced and we can't trust them. They'll smile at us just as they smiled at the French, and there's a lack of sincerity here. But what comes across overwhelmingly in British accounts and in descriptions of the population is a sense of jubilation and liberation. That I'm sure that there's a hope amongst the poorer classes in Madrid that the economic situation and the situation with food will continue to improve. Plus the tightness of the Josephine state, its control, its monitoring. You had to have permission to enter and leave the city. This is classic Napoleonic police surveillance that had been going on in Madrid, and suddenly that is all lifted. So there's that extraordinary sense of excitement and optimism when the British arrive. Yes, that'll be juxtaposed against, yes, this is another foreign army arriving and concerns about what the fate of local women might be at the hands of these soldiers, as can be the case with any foreign army or any army for that matter entering a city. Those traditional military civil tensions, they never go away. They're always bubbling there under the surface. There's always that level of anxiety about the soldier as a threat to civil society. Um, but those early days are without question one of euphoria in Madrid, at least as we can tell from the the British sources.
The one that always vividly sticks in my mind, and I forget who says this because it's been a long time since I read the accounts around Madrid, but he talks about how everybody's very effusive in their love, shall we say. And so, the ladies are going around sort of kissing the soldiers, and that's fine. But the men are doing it as well. And this particular redcoat is not sure how he feels about that. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I think that's Private Wheeler. I think it's William Wheeler who writes about that. Yes, that posed a challenge to Wheeler. I mean, we have to be careful because those British accounts too, by extolling the triumph, it's not just about Spanish reactions, but it's about magnifying themselves to their readers. So here we are as the great conquering, liberating heroes. So this was finally the welcome that they had dreamt of all those years ago that wasn't there in that cold winter in the Galician mountains in 1808, or in the heat in the Tagus Valley during in the aftermath of the Talavera campaign. So this was the triumph that they'd always been waiting, and it was officially a triumph in a Roman tradition. There was the entrance had an arch over it, and there were officially 3 days of balls and amusements. So for British soldiers who've been on the road for months and months, in the countryside, in battle, now entering what they saw as a very cosmopolitan city, certainly by Iberian standards, but indeed from their perspective, by their conception of the world, which largely meant London. Uh, for those who'd passed through, this was beyond their wildest expectations, and it comes so clearly across in the writings. And they come in as on officers on horseback, and I think I described it once as like Cortez amongst the Aztecs. It's got that kind of ring to it where the Spanish are diminutive, they're below them, they're clinging to their legs, they're clinging to the stirrups. Women are throwing, it's very chivalric. Women are throwing scarves at them, handkerchiefs, flowers. So it is an extraordinary moment for that 36,000 strong army that enters Madrid.
I wonder if that sort of conquering jubilation, because it must have been such a brilliant feeling, to walk into what's been a long-term goal for this army. And obviously we've got the benefit of hindsight and kind of know how things worked out, but I can't imagine in that, that 3 days of balls and parties, and no one imagined that, they wouldn't be there very long, it's
Yeah.
they're almost looking at the end of the French occupation of Spain at this point. And do the British jump on this almost from a propaganda point of view, both in Spain and certainly at home in Britain? Do you think?
I'm not sure how I'm not sure how Madrid itself appears in the British press in terms of the end of the we're nearing the end of the campaign for the liberation of Spain, or at least sort of overthrowing the French occupation. Um, as we know, it quickly turns in a very, very dramatic fashion indeed, as so much of the Peninsular War did. Um, I can't recall British soldiers themselves in their own accounts of Madrid openly writing about this as signifying the end of the war. They still know that they still know they've got an army in the north that's reassembling. They know that there's an army in the south in Andalusia. They know um, you have you've got French forces in Catalonia. Um, so I can't recall soldiers constructing this as the end, nearing the end of the war, but certainly they see this as the high point of the war to that point in time, and hope that this is a fundamental turning point in the war. And as you say, this is something that they dreamt of since 1808. It's literally 4 years since British soldiers first landed at Mondigo Bay in Portugal in August of 1808, in the summer of 1808, and now it's the summer of 1812 when they have finally reached Madrid, which has become this almost mythic place in soldiers' imaginings.
So inevitably, the dust settles, and now you're looking at the British troops fundamentally as well, there are two ways you can construe it, right? One is it's an army of occupation. It's there to make sure that Madrid fundamentally stays calm. It doesn't flip back to the French if that was ever a possibility. And obviously, it's also there to serve a defensive purpose.
Mm.
Hill is basically told to guard that southern flank for Wellington, whilst Wellington goes north to deal with Burgos. That therefore means that you've got soldiers who aren't on campaign, and we during the classic kind of narrative arc that people focus on when they tell this story, they inevitably follow Wellington north and
Yes.
don't tend to think about what these guys do when they're not actually doing much other than
Mm.
sitting there waiting for Soult to march north from Andalusia. So how do British soldiers occupy their time, and what tensions, if any, does that create with the locals?
So throughout the Madrid, so we've got a situation where Wellington arrives on the 12th of August. Wellington will then leave just a few weeks later. Um, and then you've still got a substantial report for ultimately Burgos. Then you've still got a substantial proportion of the British Army in Madrid. And then, as you say, you've got Hill coming, and Hill will ultimately arrive in Toledo, and then will lead the withdrawal, the evacuation of Madrid once he receives orders from Wellington at the end of October. So soldiers' accounts in Madrid tend to focus very much on those first few weeks of the euphoria and the balls. There's less on what happens to soldiers beyond those weeks, but you've still got accounts of British officers, for example, who come into Madrid on leave or are in Madrid, and they're sightseeing. So there's a lot of sightseeing during this period, and it highlights that most of the time on campaign, British soldiers, like all soldiers, they're not fighting. They've got a lot of downtime in Madrid, and the accounts of both common soldiers and officers very much focus on their leisure time and going off to visit the sites of Madrid. But that all comes to a crashing halt in October. But you've also got some darker sides to that experience of being in Madrid. So the poor, for example, where there's not a great deal of mention in British soldiers' accounts, but we've got a number of accounts. George Hennell, for example, the dissenting gentleman officer, he writes about the poor. And it's not a surprise that Hennell would pick up on that. He's one of the very few officers who does write about the poor. And in fact, there was a subscription by officers to provide soup kitchens for the poor, and they even put on a theatrical performance in Madrid to raise money for the poor. So that is there, and you've also got, again, there are not many accounts of this. William Grattan writes about this, for example. You've also got with the regime change, because you've now got a new municipal authority, you've now got a new governor of Madrid. You do have the trial and persecution and arrests of those who were sympathisers or were deemed to be sympathisers. Who knows to what extent there's political point scoring going on here and personal vendetta. Grattan talks about 150 arrests. Some historians have used that figure, about 150 arrests, including some Catholic priests, and trials and some public executions being played out. So you've got the municipal authorities getting on with regime change and the purging of the last remnants, as they see it, of Joseph's regime in Madrid. And some British soldiers pick up on that. But judging from the soldiers' accounts, they're just focused very much on relaxing. Yes, they'll have duties to perform, but relaxing and enjoying themselves in Madrid.
So whilst they are relaxing and enjoying themselves in Madrid, imagine we're British soldiers about town. We've got some time off. What are the must-see sites? And on the flip side of that, were there any sort of aspects of Madrid's culture that was either off limits or sort of to be avoided?
So the officers and those common soldiers' accounts, so Private Wheeler, Joseph Donaldson, for example, to name two men from the ranks who went and saw sites as well. There's a circuit of sites that they see. So there's the Royal Palace, and they're obsessed with Joseph, the remnants of Joseph, and they're really trying to they're obsessed with the Bonapartes, and Joseph, in some sense, is Napoleon by proxy. They recognize this as not Napoleon, but it's Napoleon's older brother, and we're close to Napoleon. So this obsession with the Bonapartes very much comes out. So they're in the royal residence, talking about Joseph's wine and enjoying Joseph's fruit and looking at his bathroom. And also they see one of the versions of Jacques Louis David's Napoleon crossing the Alps. And George Hennell, I think, writes a very moving account of that, where he's mesmerized by, it's almost like he's overcome by the charisma of Bonaparte coming through in David's painting. So they're very much on the look for the traces and remnants of the Bonapartes, and Joseph is, if you like, Napoleon by proxy. They also go out to the Casa del Campo, which is the royal residence just outside, the country residence that Joseph had taken over. So they go out there, having a look around. Joseph had introduced pheasants, so the officers enjoy shooting the pheasants in the gardens, which is very much in keeping with the British officers essentially shooting everything that moved in their hunting parties all the way through the peninsula. So that extends to Joseph's introduced pheasants. And they go to where else do they go? They go to the Royal Museum, or the Royal Academy, where they see the Italian masters. So they're doing those polite, gentlemanly things that they're expected to do for their education, what a polite, genuine officer would be expected to do in that city. They enjoy the shops. They're able to buy things that they've never been able to purchase for months and months. They enjoy in cafes, bars. They love the Prado, the Paseo de Prado, the great boulevard. And they enjoy gazing upon Spanish highborn Castilian women in their mantillas. So they're always commenting on the beauty and elegance and charm of Spanish highborn women. And they're also certainly early on going to the balls. But then they're also invited to a bullfight, which is specifically put on for them. Officers are given boxes. I think from memory, 6 rankers from every company were given tickets as well. So common soldiers could also attend. And so this extraordinary spectacle is put on, and they're both horrified and fascinated by that spectacle. They're particularly horrified by bulls goring horses. That particularly resonates with the English officer class. But they're not enamored at all with the blood sport that they see in the bull ring, and they're particularly horrified by the reaction of Spanish women applauding the bloodshed and what they see as the cruelty. So this again fits into their stereotypes of the Spanish. In terms of what's off limits, so they're both fascinated and repelled by the bullfight. It's hard to tell what's off limits. There's no sense in the officers' accounts, for example, and they certainly officers would have avoided the poorer quarters in Madrid, but there's no sense of Madrid in those accounts as being an unsafe city, which is very different, for example, to how British officers and common soldiers wrote about Lisbon, where Lisbon very much fitted into a stereotype of a land of stilettos, and you're going to be stabbed in the back in a dark alleyway, and you take your life into your own hands if you're out in narrow medieval streets after midnight as a redcoat. There's no sense of that whatsoever in accounts of Madrid.
So I was going to ask a very lazy question and ask how well behaved are they? And then I realized, well, hang on a minute, Zach, you've literally got the data on this sitting on your hard drive. So I've had a little look, and basically, with the exception of the 1st Battalion 88th Foot, i.e. the Connaught Rangers, seemingly very well behaved. There's only one trial. Well, in fact, all of the regimental trials that I've got, of which there are 13 for Madrid, are first 88th, and they're just things like theft and drunk on duty and classic things you'd expect from a redcoat at any point in time. The only general regimental I've got is a private from the 74th tried for desertion. So that's kind of shut down that little question. I was kind of hoping that we might sort of see some indication of the British sort of trying their luck and there being some kind of reaction from headquarters, and clearly that's not the case. Um,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's it's an interesting point, and it may partly be a product of the lack of boredom in Madrid, rather in rural communities and smaller towns. Um, there may well be more of propensity for those much wilder nights getting out of control and violence towards locals. Um, and there's certainly nothing in the written accounts about from soldiers' own accounts of any untoward behaviour. Now, there may well, I mean, there would have been some degree of that, particularly towards women, but it's certainly not in any of the British accounts, and clearly it's not. Well, that rarely appears anyway in general courts martial records. But um, yeah, I'm not aware of. I mean, Wellington, for example, never issued a general order about uh, any disciplinary issues in Madrid or any of the senior commanding officers.
no, I mean this would be speculation, but you can't help but wonder to what extent is Badajoz still looming large. And I mean, it does loom large in Wellington's mind all the way through to San Sebastian and beyond.
Yes,
But
that's right.
with the British having um, vented their spleen sounds sort of too trivial a way to describe the horrendous stuff that happened in Badajoz. But with that having happened,
Mm.
um, and with there being that separation from victory at Salamanca to the triumphal march into Madrid, perhaps there's a sort of difference in mindset. They've had the time to process the trauma, they've had the time to sort of let that bloodlust subside in a way that doesn't exist in Badajoz, quite obviously.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
although yeah, that's an interesting point. I would say though, Badajoz though, it had a history with British soldiers before
true.
the sack. And unlike Madrid, it's almost the juxtaposition. It's almost the polar opposite of Madrid. Badajoz represents in British soldiers' minds, even before the 1812 siege, an ungrateful, inhospitable Spain for those who'd been quartered in Badajoz earlier in the war in it was 1809. Whereas there's no past presence in Madrid, and the circumstances in which they enter Madrid is just completely the complete opposite. They enter Madrid in triumph on horseback to welcome in crowds. Badajoz, they finally get through uh, the back door, if you like, of the city during the horrendous storming operation. Um, and even there's a sense that those who'd stayed in the city perhaps were sympathizing with the French. So it's a very different political environment to what we find in Madrid. And of course, what's true of Madrid will not be true of San Sebastian. Uh, exactly 1 year later, in August of 1813. And there again, you have a different politics playing out with a sense, certainly in post-British rationalizations of the sack violence, that there was a contingent within San Sebastian who were sympathetic um, to Joseph and the the French state.
Yeah, I'm reining myself in. We could go on a whole conversation
Yeah,
about
that's
the
right.
contrast between San Sebastian and Badajoz because we're both very
Yeah,
interested in it. But The quartermaster's BDI, the redcoat in residence, is looking at me, kind of saying, "Stick to the bill sheet for this one." So
Yeah. Yeah.
let's talk about assimilation. Um, to what extent do the British sort of assimilate with the Spanish, in particular in terms of the Madrileño culture? Just firstly, talk us through what that is. Um, and is there any kind of indication about lasting relationships, whether those be fundamentally romantic or whether they might be something more platonic between people in the city and the Redcoats?
I'm not I'm not aware of any officers, for example, or rankers in their accounts talking about romantic relationships in Madrid that then extended beyond Madrid. I suspect there were some Spanish women. It would be unusual if there weren't. There were some Spanish women that left Madrid with the British Army. How many we don't know, but we know that you've got a substantial number of Spanish women and Portuguese women that travel, that become part of the Anglo-Portuguese campaign community throughout the war, and many of whom are then left behind. Most of whom are then left behind. But I'm not sure. I'm not aware of a kind of Harry Smith type romance going back to, I shouldn't go back to Badajoz, but a Harry Smith type romance blossoming out of the experience of British officers in Madrid. But given the fact that they were there for a substantial period of time, relatively speaking, in terms of the overall campaign, being in one city for nearly 3 months, it would be unusual if there weren't certainly a handful of long-term relationships forged there that then extended beyond the British period, the British presence in Madrid itself. We do know that generally speaking, British soldiers, when they fraternized with Spanish women, they always felt that they didn't come up to par with French officers. And that feeds into classic stereotypes of French gallantry and French civility and French chivalry. But certainly, British officers are spending a lot of time at balls and wandering around arm in arm, sometimes publicly with Spanish aristocratic women in Madrid. So there must have been at least some long-term relationships emerging out of that.
And also in relation to this Madrileño culture and that kind of assimilation, just talk us through what that term means.
I mean, you see that a lot. I mean, I'm not clear what that, I mean, what's your sense of that? I'm not entirely sure of what's characterized by that in terms of a distinctive Madrid characteristic.
I think it comes from a sort of place of similar to what you talked about with the sort of juxtaposition with Madrid and Badajoz. It's almost the sort of the center of Spanish civility, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
that sort of we are culturally significant through our diversity, through our education, through our sort of expansive freedoms,
yeah,
economic prosperity. I know we talked about the famine, but in a sort of general sense.
yeah,
And I think that's the sort of basis,
yeah.
or certainly what that sort of I can't even pronounce
Where
that. I'm
when
going
there
to
was,
absolutely murder
yeah,
it.
yeah. So I mean, it's polite society, it's British perceptions of polite society, but the idea in this sense that that Madrid is the epicenter of Spanish polite culture. And so in Madrid, British officers often write about the education of elites in Madrid, polite society in Madrid, that it's learned that you've got a learned culture in Madrid, that this is with polite society echoing through the balls, through the Prado, in dress, in refinement. And that's something that they find pockets of elsewhere in Spain, but they firmly associate that with Madrid high culture. So it's above all the perception of a cosmopolitan high culture. So in one sense, it celebrates cosmopolitan. On the other hand, it's seen as this exceptionalism within Spain that's also seen as distinctly Spanish. But they do, I think George Hennell might even talk about this was a perfect city for a gentleman's city residents, and they compare St James's Park with parks that they find in Madrid. So it's both a case of Spanish exceptionalism with Madrid, but also anchoring this in their broader sense of what constitutes a polite civil society. And they find that in Madrid. They find books in Madrid. They're always writing about there are no books in Spain, highlighting from their perspective its backwardness and the idea that it's unenlightened. But this in Madrid, there's a sense that there is a cosmopolitan enlightenment here to a degree.
But they haven't found that in Salamanca. Granted, my perception of Salamanca is 100% influenced by having walked the city that it is
Yeah,
today,
yeah,
which is, the old city is fundamentally a sprawling university campus and it's stunning. But it does have that sense of, and again, maybe this is just influenced by modern perception. When you transition from the countryside, having sort of wandered the towns and villages to explore the battlefields, and then you go into Salamanca, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, Ciudad Rodrigo, there is a difference in mood, in the state of all of the buildings, in the tempo, in everything. It feels like a very different place. Now, yes, that's going to be things like tax revenue today and university environments and all the rest of it. But the buildings themselves say something, and the buildings haven't changed that much actually in Salamanca in the course of 200 years. You can tell from the style of them.
yeah.
So I'm just slightly surprised that they haven't sort of seen at least pockets of that
Oh, they
along the
have.
way.
Yeah, yeah, they have. Yeah, and Salamanca is one of those examples. Pamplona later on, and also San Sebastian as well. There's a great lamentation about the burning of San Sebastian because they talk about how ordered it was because it's a grid. Sorry, I know I've gone to San Sebastian again, but it's another example. So Madrid is the greatest example of this by far. But yes, there are pockets of that throughout. They encounter these urban, slightly more cosmopolitan pockets of Spain where they recognize their own sense of civility and polite culture. Most definitely. Um, I think, and there are some parts of Portugal as well where that's true. Um,
Well, certainly not in Lisbon, if we're
not
to
in, not in,
believe what the Redcoats say when they land.
yeah, there are one or two. They still there are parts of Lisbon that they still enjoy, but overwhelmingly no. It's a completely different perception and experience to that which they encounter in Madrid. But Madrid is some of those other urban pockets writ large on this extraordinary canvas.
So I want to take us forward a little bit to sort of look at perhaps some of the legacy of the British presence in Madrid. We spoke about earlier that some of the British Army only stayed for a couple of weeks, and the rest for sort of almost 3 months.
Mm.
But where did Madrid fit into British soldiers' memories of the war, and I guess of their time in the peninsula as a whole?
Yeah. So if we use someone like John Kincaid as an example, who has such a decorated career and serves in Waterloo, fights at Waterloo. Kincaid saw Madrid as the high point of his military career, full stop. So it's a complex situation in terms of where Madrid fits in soldiers' memories, because their overarching sense of this as the most exalted experience of their military careers in terms of the triumphal entry into Madrid and their veneration by locals and all that celebration, that is quickly challenged by the humiliating circumstances in which they're forced to leave on the run. And those, by the time they're in winter quarters back in Portugal in 1813, those memories of Madrid are getting dimmer and dimmer. So there's both the triumph and the tragedy, if you like, of the British entry into Madrid and the way in which they then are forced to exit Madrid, being chased by two converging French armies from the south, and Wellington having to come Burgos, getting to Salamanca, and then the terrible conditions in which they find themselves in November of 1812, and Wellington's famous reprimand of his officers during that retreat. So that we've got, on the one hand, you've got the triumphant march from Salamanca to Madrid and their time in Madrid, and then that's juxtaposed with how the humiliation in which the campaign ends. So Madrid features still in their memories of the war, still very much in that complex mix of different Spains. There's their notion of an ungrateful Spain, notion of a superstitious Spain, notions of a primitive, backward Spain that's unenlightened. And then you've got Madrid representing a more civilized Spain and a much more romantic Spain. But overall, in soldiers' general perceptions of Spain, those who'd been to Madrid, that memory dims relative to those other negative characterizations of Spain. So it coexists, it's there in soldiers' memories, but they carry, generally speaking, more negative, hostile memories of their overall experience in Spain. But Madrid is without question the highlight for most of them in terms of their experience of Spain during the Peninsular War. And for someone like Kincaid, never surpassed in terms of his military career.
Gavin, it's always a joy to speak to you. Thank you so much for such a cracking interview, folks. Head to Cambridge University Press's website, where you can get Storm and Sack, British Sieges, Violence, and the Laws of War in the Napoleonic Era, 1799 to 1815. It's now available in paperback, so you don't need to flinch at academic press price tags, which we discuss a great deal on this show.
Good.
If you also want to read about Gavin's wider work on British soldiers during the Peninsular War more generally, and particularly kind of speaking to a lot of what we've talked about today, then go to Palgrave Macmillan, where you will find The British Soldier in the Peninsular War, Encounters in Spain and Portugal, 1808 to 1814. It's a cracking book, a genuinely important book. Frankly, it's a book that I wish I'd written, so I'm ever so slightly jealous of it, which gives you an indication, like, it's seriously good. So go to Palgrave Macmillan for that. Cambridge University Press for Storm and Sack. Gavin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for dealing with the time difference as well, and we look forward to welcoming you back very soon. Folks, do me a favor. Go and review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment, crucially. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the most powerful thing you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people subscriptions to the Patreon perks we offer? So, If you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, book clubs, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much, much more. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month. So if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-January 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, Daniel Friedman, and Jonathan Willets. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.